my talk today is Trauma Transfigured, Beauty from Pain, and let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, so an overview of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to be discussing traumatic memory, healing trauma, and post-traumatic growth, and integrating and exploring these topics from polyvagal theory, internal family systems, and our Orthodox theology. I encourage you to please take care of yourself. So I'm not going to be speaking in any graphic detail about kind of any specific kinds of trauma per se, and sometimes even whenever we discuss the impacts of trauma, if we've been through disturbing and upsetting things in our past, it can activate us and it can bring stuff up. I will not be offended if you need to take a bathroom break, or for folks who are not in this room today but are listening to this talk later on via YouTube or podcast. I invite you to do what you need to honor where your body's at today. Okay, so before we kind of jump in further into some of the more kind of content that I'm going to talk about, I want to lead us in a guided meditation that's all about safe place. And so I'm going to invite us to take some deep breaths together and then kind of guide us through just picturing whatever that safe place is for you. And then we'll have some time if you would like to share at the end kind of what you notice. So let's all take some deep breaths. We're going to breathe in through the nose and out through your mouth. Really lengthening those exhales, breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. Do another breath together, breathing in. And breathing out. And so I invite you to just notice how your body's doing today, right in this moment. If it feels comfortable, if you haven't yet, you might close your eyes. Or you could just soften your gaze and look towards the floor. Would anyone like to share, no pressure, but would anyone like to share if there was anything that you noticed, anything that came up for you in this exercise?
Are you saying like physical, or just
anything?
For me, it was finding that place that makes me feel calm. And when I did that, I felt calm, and just the whole moment of just stopping and, you said, using the ears, like what are you hearing, what are you smelling, really can help me feel grounded in that moment again. I think it's really easy for us to think of the future and past a lot, so that felt nice.
Yeah, you felt something in your body. You were like, oh. And you can kind of slow down. Yeah. Thank you. Eleni, right?
Yeah.
Eleni. Awesome. Can I see another hand?
For me, it was in the face of a friend / spiritual mother. And also knowing that whatever we discussed, it would be more like affirmative inquiry, not like, oh, you did that and you suck. It's more like that safety of being able to tell the truth without shaming the other person.
Yeah. Sense of feeling really seen and known by this beloved friend. Spiritual.
Yeah, I was by a fire, and so all the sensations around that, like smelling the smoke and just hearing the crackling, and I was kind of by myself at first. When you mentioned seeing other people were there, it brought me back to that place. It's like it doesn't really matter who I'm sitting with by a fire. It's like no one's ever really talking. Everybody's just staring into the one thing, which took me back to Dr. Rossi's talk yesterday about silence and just being there together. It was like I could see feet of people sitting around the fire, but it didn't matter who it was necessarily in that moment to me.
That's so beautiful. Just able to be in that present moment together and not talking, just soaking it in and taking that together. The reason for this picture is that this is my safe place, one of my safe places. This is a monastery. It's very beloved to me, where I feel like I can be myself. And so I think it's important as we talk about trauma and as we kick off this conversation, that this is where we start. We start with safety. We start with goodness, because a huge part of, by God's grace, being healing to trauma, processing traumatic memory, is actually incrementally, gradually being able to access safety and being able to receive that and actually take that. So, without further ado, let's dive in. So, what is traumatic memory? Question number one. So, traumatic memory, kind of looking from the DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is characterized, here, sorry, let me turn this off. There we go, okay. Is characterized by the following symptoms. But first, kind of let me pause and just say, sometimes whenever we say trauma, we think about like the objective event that happened. Somebody experienced abuse, someone experienced, someone went to war, right? And those things are certainly often, very, very often, of course, experienced as traumatic. Whenever I say trauma and when we talk about traumatic memory, it's really more about what happens inside of us in response to what happened outside of us. So trauma is more the imprint inside of what happens inside of us in response to that traumatic event. And so we have these symptoms of intrusion. So classically, if you're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, you've got flashbacks or you have nightmares. Maybe a little bit more subtle, this can also look like any kind of cue or moment that brings an intense physiological response in response to a trigger. It's like the kind of hallmark of trauma and of intrusive symptoms is that it feels like it's happening all over again. It feels like in my body that it's happening all over again. And so of course then, right, folks are gonna go to avoidance, because if I'm kind of walking around on eggshells looking for that next trigger, and that's gonna set me off and bring this intense, like I feel like it's happening all over again, of course I'm gonna wanna avoid. And so that kind of progressively is gonna make our worlds smaller and kind of distance us more and more from reality. Then we have alterations in arousal and reactivity. So hypervigilance is this idea of I'm like on edge, I'm looking over my shoulder, I'm waiting, for the other foot to drop. And I'm having a hard time accessing that goodness and that safety because my brain and my body have adapted so that I'm seeing the world as, not safe and not able to take in the good. And then our negative cognitions and our mood alterations. So feeling detached from others, feeling estranged from others, struggling to connect, and persistent and exaggerated beliefs about ourselves and the world. So this can look like it was all my fault. If I had done something different, it wouldn't have happened. This can look like, I can never trust anyone again. Like I'm so broken and I can never be healed. Those kinds of beliefs that are persistent and that really shape then how we're able to see the world whenever we've experienced trauma. And then there's also dissociative symptoms, which aren't technically required for PTSD diagnosis, but they're pertinent and important for our discussion today. And so that looks like kind of a sense of unreality from either ourselves or the world. So like often trauma survivors might describe feeling as though they're watching themselves through a video camera, like they're not in their body, right? Or feeling that the world around them isn't real. And so we see that the impacts of trauma, right? It distances us more and more from ourselves and more from others and more from the physical world around us. So Mary Harvey says that trauma survivors have symptoms instead of memories. And I think that this is a really beautiful way to put and kind of offer a some validation to many trauma survivors who might feel like, well, I don't really remember what happened, right? And so it doesn't really impact me. Well, what happened to me, it wasn't that bad, and so sometimes, it happened to me before, like when I was really little, and I don't remember remember. Or they might feel really confused about why they're having these different symptoms. And the reality is that whenever we think of the word memory, we usually think of explicit memory. So that's like, this is what I ate yesterday, or this is like the concrete thing that I remember that happened in the past. Implicit memory looks like emotional reactions. It looks like kind of those physical, right, physiological reactions. It looks like perceptual reactions. So I've been through trauma in the past. I feel, I don't know, somebody declines an invite that I've given them to coffee, and my perceptual reaction is, oh, it's because they don't like me, or they must hate me. So and I might not, if I'm not attuned to that, if I haven't done some work around that, I might not even notice that that's happening, and all of a sudden I'm angry with my husband later on in the day. And he's like, what's going on? And I'm like, I'm fine. And he's like, you're not. So it's really important that we support folks and just be able to understand that often traumatic memories are stored implicitly. The part of our brain that's responsible for filing, in a filing cabinet, oh, that's what I ate for breakfast, or okay, I remember this for my test tomorrow, right? Whenever we go through something intensely overwhelming and traumatic, that part of our brain goes offline. And so for trauma survivors, they're truly living in a kind of hell because the trauma isn't over. The traumatic event is not over. The abuse I went through is not over. The war I went through is not over. It's still happening in my body. And so the process of treating trauma in mental health counseling, and I think there's a beautiful synergy with our Orthodox faith and our Orthodox church. And it helps us, right? We're trying to support that person and being able to bring to completion the response that's still going on in their body and creating great distress. So from polyvagal theory, there's this idea of, I don't choose, right, to be traumatized. Trauma is a thing that happens, it's something that happens to me. And it's my body's way of protecting me and making sure that I can survive. And so our nervous system is continuously scanning for safety and for threat, and this idea of neuroception. And so we have these different nervous system states, according to polyvagal theory, which is kind of under the umbrella of interpersonal neurobiology. We have our social engagement state, and that's hopefully, what you were able to access whenever we did our safe place meditation, or at least access it a little bit, right? You're feeling connected, you're feeling present, you're feeling grounded, you're feeling safe. You're feeling like hopefully you can access your thinking brain to take in what I'm sharing. And then what can happen in response to a trigger is we go into fight or flight. This is very adaptive, right? If there's a tiger, I'm not gonna oh, what are my courses of action? Let's see here. I could do this, I could do this. God has made our bodies so that we know we can respond right away to get away from that threat and keep ourselves safe and keep others safe. What can happen if our body determines, right, and this is all without my conscious awareness, this is our autonomic nervous system, the most primitive part of our bodies. If my body determines I can't fight and I can't flee, what happens next is we go into freeze. And freeze is when you might think about like a possum, right? It's playing dead, or animals, the prey animal will freeze because what the body is actually doing is it's mobilizing to try to protect us against the inevitable pain of death, essentially, right? So, and what happens for animals is that then they're able to kind of shake it off. You'll notice if anybody went around the path and saw the deer, right? They kind of, and then after they're okay, all right, threat's gone, all right, and they kind of shake, right? Or they do something, or they sneeze, or they shake it off. With humans, sometimes we have a hard time of calming back down and kind of down regulating back to where we're in our social engagement state. And so whenever we talk about kind of trauma, the trauma continuing to essentially it's continuing to happen, like the traumatic memory is continuing to happen. One way of thinking about that is that we're stuck in that dorsal vagal, which is our freeze state. And so you can see in freeze that that's where we're dissociated, we're detached. We have a really hard time connecting to others. And another way that trauma impacts us, again, our bodies God has made our bodies adapted to survive and to be resilient, is that if I've been through trauma, my nervous system is going to be primed for threat. And so what can happen is that then I like to think about it like when I'm trying to change a gear on a bike. If I'm riding a bike, I'm trying to change the gear. It's like the gear gets stuck. And it's hard for trauma survivors to come back down all the way back to social engagement. So the work of trauma therapy is supporting folks and kind of strengthening that ability to kind of oil that gear up to be able to okay, and now I can gear back down. It's not happening, even though it feels in my body like it's happening. I know it's not happening. And how can I kind of calm myself, support myself, and calm back down? So coming from an internal family systems perspective, this is another way to conceptualize trauma. So this internal family systems is a theory developed by Dr. Richard Schwartz. And Dr. Schwartz noticed in years of working with trauma survivors that he was a family therapist by training. And he noticed that the way clients were talking, it was like they were talking about these parts inside of themselves. And so and he realized it's like we have a family inside of us. And so with an internal family theory, internal family systems perspective, we have our exiles, and these are the traumatized parts. So our exiles, right? Nobody escapes childhood unscathed. Life, right? This is inherent to life on Earth, that there is pain and there is suffering, and we take that in different ways. And so we have these exile parts that are holding the wounds, that are holding the pain, that are holding the abandonment, because a kiddo is not going to understand. For instance, when mom and dad divorce, they're not going to be able to comprehend that that's not their fault, because how a kiddo's brain works is they're the center of the world. So it's this is my fault. So that would be an example potentially of, then there's this really young wounded part of them that feels like if I had just done something different, mom and dad wouldn't have that. And so then what we have is we have these protector parts, these managers on one side who try at all costs to avoid that part from getting triggered, and firefighter parts that's oh no, we're triggered, okay, put it out, let the fire out, whatever the collateral damage is, I don't care, I just need the pain to go away. Often that can look like addiction, right? And one that I often go to for managers for explaining would be potentially perfectionism, right? If I can just be perfect, this little part of me will not get triggered. And so underneath that, we have what's called the self. And I'm not a theologian by training. I come from a psychology background. But for me, there's beautiful overlap between the spiritual organ of our nous, right? That we talk about in our church, and the way that Jake Schwartz describes the self, which is that underneath the parts, we have a piece of us that's not actually a part. It's really our core self, our true self, underneath kind of all that noise and pain on top. And the self is calm, curious, connected, compassionate, courageous, confident, creative, and clear. It's intuitive. It's able to be in the present moment. And so kind of understanding what trauma does, right? It burdens these different parts, especially our exiles, but also our protectors. Protectors are going to take on extreme roles to try to protect that exile. And our parts become increasingly polarized. And so there's a big kind of push-pull, which is what we can see with intense rigidity or intense chaos in folks that we're working with who have experienced trauma. So an orthodox perspective on trauma is that trauma evidences the fragmentation that began in the Garden of Eden, which afflicts all of us. So there's this beautiful quote from Archimandrite Meletius Weber that was possibly the driving quote that helped me kind of on my journey from my Protestant background into Orthodoxy to kind of just heal and reshape how I was, just understanding the relationship between me and God, which is that the story of Adam and Eve is at its heart a story of disintegration, fragmentation, and estrangement. Each and every person is internally fragmented and externally isolated from the outside world, right down to the ultimate depths of his or her being. And so in our Eastern Orthodox tradition, right, the driving metaphor of what salvation is, how we relate to God, what the church is not one of judicial, it's one of healing, and one of, right, we're fragmented and we need healing to come back together. And so that fragmentation is not only between me and God, it's also between me and my neighbor, and it's also within myself, right? And that kind of internal family systems theory perspective, there's this polarization. There's all these different pieces of me, right, that need to be kind of brought together in Christ. Father Stephen Friedman talks about trauma as being a toxic shame, which alienates us from the world and from ourselves, and thus creates a false self, which obscures our true self, right? So the ego and we develop this false self that where there's a quote of, God can save the sinner you are, but not the saint you pretend to be. And so we have this saint that we pretend to be, instead of kind of being able to access that true self. Trauma excommunicates us and isolates us from ourselves and from one another. And Dr. Timothy Petitsis, in his Ethics of Beauty, has a very beautiful section on PTSD. And he talks about how trauma teaches us lies, a partial distorted truth, or a heretical truth. And so kind of what that could look like, right, thinking back to our PTSD. I also wanted to note, I will have this PowerPoint available online, and I'm happy to send it to anyone. So don't feel like you have to. I should have started with that at the outset. Okay, because I know I'm moving through a lot. So Dr. Timothy Petitsis in Ethics of Beauty talks about how we have a partial distorted truth or a heretical truth whenever we've been through trauma. And so we can think back to our PTSD criteria of negative cognitions about ourselves and the world, right? This is all my fault. If it wasn't my fault, this wouldn't have happened. I can never trust anyone again. Everyone is cruel and bad, or kind of whatever those extreme kind of beliefs are. We can see this as a distorted truth or a heretical truth. And he also has a very poignant line, which is that traumatic experiences are a terrible force feeding from the knowledge of good and evil. And so what we're going to see, as we move into what it means to heal trauma, is that this is part of why he talks about we cannot approach trauma from cognitive, kind of only rational, truth first, because what that's doing is it's actually re-traumatizing. It's approaching kind of from the knowledge of good and evil. And so instead, right, not that that's not an important component, but the true component that we most need is a beauty first approach, and is an approach that is relational, because a trauma survivor has already been through the terrible force feeding of knowledge of good and evil, and they don't need that from us. So the church teaches us again that our fallen nature leaves us wounded and sick, that Christ is our great physician, and that the church is our hospital. And so again, I see such beautiful synergy between these approaches of, approaching counseling and kind of just, again, integrating our theology in our work with clients, and in understanding our own journeys towards healing. Because all of us in this room, whatever discipline you're in, And even if you're not, right, in a healing profession, we're all wounded healers, and we're all becoming wounded healers by God's grace. So let's talk a little bit about how trauma is healed. So from a polyvagal theory perspective, Dr. Stephen Porges says that feeling safe is the treatment, and creating safety is the work. And so going back to what we started this workshop off with, right, a safe place meditation, maybe for some of you, you might have noticed that instead of feeling calm and grounded, as soon as you went inward, it actually felt overwhelming. And that, whether or not that happened kind of to anyone in this room, often this can happen for our clients that we're working with. Because, right, part of the protective part of trauma is that I'm not in reality, but this reality is intolerable. It's incredibly painful. And so, incrementally, gradually, like breadcrumb by breadcrumb by breadcrumb, we are helping our clients be able to access that safety, be able to access that support, and take some of that in, right? Even if you were only able to take a little bit of good, a little bit of safety in, that in and of itself is transformative, and that is the work. And we have this kind of, it's like a dance or a tension between, right? The honoring the Auntie Colbert in her Strong Like Water talks about it as situational strength, like the rigidity that I make to keep myself safe. Like I can honor that that's what I needed to do to survive. And also, God's invitation is to move us through into a transitional strength of acknowledging that and recognizing, okay, I'm in my situational strength. What do I need to do next? And then moving into that integrated strength. Where it's like, you know what? The threat is over, and this is kind of where my agency and my choice is, and how I can show up in an integrated, more holistic way. And so, this quote from her. Compassionate resourcing, Auntie Colbert says this in Strong Like Water. Compassionate resourcing is learning to have a posture of coming alongside and remaining responsive to the parts of ourselves and our stories that do not yet feel safe. Then at the pace and in the ways we're able, we begin to offer experiences, connections, and moments to ourselves that do communicate that safety. And this image over here is talking about the window of tolerance. And so kind of thinking back to the image of our polyvagal theory, our social engagement, fight, flight, and freeze, you might think about it as if, right, hyperarousal, that would be the fight, flight, is on the top, right? Hypoarousal is that freeze, that depression, shame, numbing. And then in the middle, we have this window where I'm able to think clearly, or think more clearly, right? We don't have to be 100% in social engagement. The work is often just getting, can I just have like 1% of my window of tolerance, my social engagement state, and then gently kind of trying to expand that window, because if I have been deeply traumatized, my window of tolerance is razor thin, because nothing feels tolerable. And of course nothing feels tolerable, because, right, this is what has happened to my body, and whenever I am, working through my trauma, trying to process my trauma, it's like we're slowly expanding that window so that I can show up more and more present, relational, and actually getting to live in reality, getting to live in my life, and connect with others. From an internal family systems perspective, we can understand processing trauma as being unburdening of parts. So remembering back to the example of, let's say there's a really young part of me that feels like if I had just been different, if I had just been good or something, Dad wouldn't have left. So that's a burden that this young part is carrying, right? And so what it would look like to unburden that part, just through the process of internal family systems, is that part is actually able to release that burden and then be transformed into being able to be playful and be curious and feel loved and feel safe. And And then protector parts are released from this pain of feeling the burden of responsibility to care for that really young part. So often a protector part, remember the managers and firefighters, are acting like parentified children, like a kiddo who really should not have that level of responsibility on them, right, on their shoulders. And so it's like the self. As a therapist, I'm helping my client be able to access self-energy, be able to kind of slowly invite these protector parts to step back a little bit and give us some space. If they're not ready yet, that's okay, we honor it. And we keep pressing in and we keep working to where, right, the parts slowly are like, okay. And then what happens is that when the wounded part experiences that self-energy, it's like they're getting the witness and the love and the care that they never got, that they never themselves experienced, right? Because this is all about felt sense. I can at the same time know that my parents did the best they could with what they had, and also hold in tension the fact that this young part of me feels incredibly abandoned, right, and incredibly in pain. And whenever we are able to move towards the pain, feel it, and let the shame and the emotion rush over us, but be able to be present with that, with this part of us that's the self-energy that's tracking, that's with. And then this young part feels seen and feels like, oh my gosh, I can relax. And it starts to feel like the bad thing's not happening all over again. It takes time and it's gradual and it's incredibly beautiful to behold. And so this unfolds into post-traumatic growth. And so kind of from a secular perspective, this is certainly a phenomenon that we do see, where folks who have been traumatized or who've experienced loss and grief, because trauma inherently has a deep component of loss and grief. Folks who are able to move towards the pain, walk through it, get the resources and support that they need, and often come out on the other side with new perspective, new meaning, and a deeper understanding of themselves. It can be an invitation to a deeper journey inward and to deeper connection with others. And also, as helpers, we never want to rush or force. We can't. We cannot rush or force traumatic growth, post-traumatic growth rather. What it looks like is kind of being alert and open to that possibility and attending to it and highlighting the strength and resilience that arises as we see that in the work with the folks whom we are serving. Because you can't get post-traumatic growth if you have not, it's like, I think it's Dr. Patizas has this image of that it's like we're being the Panagia at the cross. Like we are beholding and suffering and feeling all that is, and we have to feel that first before we can authentically live, be present, and be connected together. Okay, so I'm going to skip this activity, but I would invite you to do this. I'll just kind of briefly explain what it is. So look up still face experiment. So if you're taking notes, write that down. So this is an astounding experiment where whenever a child, when a caregiver, and it can be so ever slight, when a caregiver goes from an engaged, right, to a still face, the baby immediately feels it and becomes distressed. And it's not just littles who do this, right? It's all of us too. So try it out with a buddy later on. Pick a topic, any topic, and say, okay, can you try a still face? And notice what happens in your body. This can be very powerful for just tuning into that relational, emotional, limbic nervous system that we have and kind of understanding what it means when we talk about beauty first, being with suffering, being connected in suffering. So anyways, I encourage you to check this out later at your leisure. Okay, so healing trauma from an Orthodox perspective. I love this quote from St. Maximus the Confessor. Only love overcomes the fragmentation of human nature. I might cry. Only love overcomes the fragmentation of human nature. And so healing is gradual, it is relational, it is communal, it is liturgical, and it must involve our nous. So Father Stephen Nous talks about like how this is like our right brain. This is our heart, which, as we know as Orthodox Christians, it's distinct from what the world might kind of say when we think of heart and we think of kind of emotions or feelings. There's this kind of deeper center of myself, right? Again, coming from an internal family systems perspective, that self. And healing is in the rhythm of our church. We practice bearing a little shame, as St. Sophrony said, in the form of healthy shame or humility. And so Father Stephen Freeman talks about healthy shame versus toxic shame. And healthy shame, especially if that shame word is kind of creates a stumbling block for you, you might just think about it like humility, right? Like I can know that I am dust and I am loved. Like that is healthy shame. That is like humility. Versus I am bad and I cannot draw near God. That's toxic shame. I love this quote from Mother Silwana. She talks about how we allow Christ to untie.
Our flight was canceled. It's back
You're
on.
good. So good. No, all good.
Thank you.
That's
This is
fantastic. We allow Christ to untie our dirty bandages that we have like put on our wounds, right, to try to like heal it. It's like Christ asks us to let him untie those dirty bandages and tend to our wounds. And literally, we are spoon-fed every week in the divine liturgy by the medicine of immortality. And so again, right, the driving metaphor of our faith is that it's one of healing. It's one of God bringing us together, God integrating us, God making us whole. And so in the spiritual life, gradually and steadily, right, again, window of tolerance, compassionate resourcing ever so steady, right, slowly but surely, taking in that goodness, taking in that life. And there's this wisdom, deep wisdom of the church that it's like, it will take our whole life to do this. This is a journey. It's not something that happens like that. Salvation is, we were saved, we are saved, and we will be saved. And so healing is a movement from trying to put our parts together without grace. Again, God cannot save the sinner you pretend to be. So healing is a movement from trying to put our parts together without grace to living together with forgiveness and being healed by remembering. Putting ourselves, right, being remembered, by remembering ourselves in love in the community of the beloved. And that is Father Stephen Nous speaking in a talk on trauma and transfiguration, which I would highly recommend. It will be in my references slide, so go look at it. And so I, kind of began to touch on this a little bit earlier, but kind of continuing this reflection, healing needs to come from a beauty first place rather than from a truth first place. Because if trauma is a terrible force feeding of the knowledge of good and evil, what is needed to heal the heart is not knowing in my mind that I'm broken. It is being brought back into communion with others and with myself and with the world. And so functionally, what this looks like clinically, one of the things we know about what makes counseling work is the therapeutic relationship. And actually, it's not that the modality doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter that much as long as you feel that connection, that understanding, you feel felt, you feel seen by the therapist who is working with you. And this is again, Dr. Petit says, the opposite of war is not peace, but liturgy. the cognitive, bodily, totalizing act that steadily increases communion instead of cutting it. Christ's liturgy can absorb any amount of chaos and bring it back towards me. I'm just going to be quiet for a second because that's beautiful. And so, only Christ can truly transfigure our trauma, right? We can be emotionally well-adjusted and spiritually unwell. We can be deeply traumatized and not emotionally healed, and yet Christ can shine through like the sun that like gleams in the last rays of the light, like against like the beautiful fields and mountains. Christ is the only one who can truly transform and transfigure our trauma. And especially in the deepest and darkest and hardest like stories, which we see as healers, right? You see those clients and those patients where, or maybe it's just me, but I imagine where you're driving home and thinking, God, where are you? Where are you, right? And yet he is there. He is there, and the consolation is that the deepest suffering that you feel and that your patients, your clients feel, Christ felt too. And so this quote is from St. Maximus the Confessor. God has made himself a beggar by reason of his concern for us, suffering mystically through his tenderness to the end of time, according to the measure of each one's suffering. I didn't include the scripture on here, but I also think about how God he catches every tear in a bottle, right? He is catching our every tear. This is Dr. Petitsis. The point of Christ's suffering of his liturgy is that he can take all of the chaos of the world, he can take all of that everything and convert it into life. And so what I long for you to hear deeply in your heart, and may I hear it in my heart as well, is that God loves us with infinite tenderness, and in his love we are remembered. God is with us. He is with us. The deepest part of trauma is that it feels like I am all alone and God is not there. And yes, we may have that subjective experience, and also he is with us. And he knows our every sorrow, our every suffering, down to the most intimate, hidden, ashamed corners of our hearts. So in the valley of the shadow of death, may we know that God is near. In our darkest days, may we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. May we hold fast to Christ, for in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. Sorry guys, I'm getting emotional.
It's okay.
The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So, thanks be to God.
Amen.
All right, that was my or reflections. I would love to just hear, like maybe we could just have some quiet and sit with, like what is arising in you, what's coming up in you, like what reflections would you like to share?
Reflection. I'm listening to you, and the vision I had was when Saint Lazarus died, that Jesus was not there, and his Lazarus sisters were saying, "We're too late," and he came, and he said, "Now I'm going to be here," and he said, "Move the rock." He did not say, "I got this one, step aside, I will take care of from this on." He said, "Move the rock." And what I'm hearing through what you're saying is that we, the providers, the servers, it sounds from what you're saying, we are moving the rock. Jesus is going to resurrect our patients, but we are moving the rock, because otherwise, without us, the rock is going to be there. Can he do it? Absolutely. but He has given us that blessing. So thank you.
When I think about, or hearing about, Christ transfigure my trauma.
Yeah.
This was even a discussion I was having with my friend last night is, I thought I worked this out before. And all of a sudden it's kind of coming back in a different, and I guess what I'm saying, in my soul, I feel like, well, yes, that's going to be happening to the end of time for me, I suppose. To have that bodily reaction to trauma, the memory, it is a bodily thing.
It is.
It's not the event. It is, what's my body telling me and where is my brain going with it?
Yeah.
And it's coming back at a different, level.
Yeah.
And I just would like it to go away.
Of course you would.
Yeah.
Of course you would.
Yeah.
And the healing, right? It's like I've been sitting with doing exam prayers recently, and they talk about laying all the stones of the day, laying everything before the Lord and bringing it before the Lord. And I think that's the eschatological, we're not there yet, and we long to be there.
Yeah.
And the brokenness in the world, it runs, the line of good and evil runs through every heart. We feel it in the deepest, darkest, hardest places of ourselves.
Yeah.
And each time that pain comes up, it's like this invitation to not abandon my own self and my own little parts of my suffering.
Right.
Because whenever I'm able to move towards her, attend to her, what that actually does is that deepens my ability to understand and see someone that's suffering in another person, and to do that wounded healer work that then allows me to really, to show up and I think it's the question that we also Christ, can you? Where are you? Why have you forsaken me? And can you transfigure my trauma? And I think that it's a mystery, and it's this is the question that we're living. It's even if I know, yes, I know God, that you can make meaning of my suffering. The work is, but do I know? And that's a process, and it's okay that we're not there. So I don't know.
Thank you. No, beautiful. Thank you.
I just sorry, it's okay if I say something. I just had kind of a reflection from what you said and the comment on Lazarus. It's there's this moment, right, where the Lord shows up and he invites the people to participate in the healing, right? To move the stone away. I love that. So good. But we're afraid because it's gonna stink. Right? We don't want to see what's in there. We're no, it's been in there for 4 days. Don't. It's gonna be bad.
That's true.
Yeah. And so he's it's okay. We'll take care of this. And so they move it. Lazarus comes out. He's unbound by the community. He's restored to relationship. But then he's gonna die again. And this is what I think we're kind of getting to this. It's we see again still the itchings of death inside of us all the time. And it's only in the final resurrection that we hope we'll experience it. But we have the hope because we've already seen Lazarus risen from the dead.
Often says he never smiled after he was brought back from life.
Except one time,
Yeah.
when he saw someone picking a jar in anger,
He thought that.
and laughed at that, so that's the clay kicking the clay.
Yeah.
And
not to state the obvious, but Christ took his time to heal that trauma. He didn't immediately resurrect Lazarus. He wanted to wait for a little while, which you said about not trying to enter the, what was it, I forgot if it's the dorsal system, you know, that's challenging stuff, you know, we have to, if they're gonna enter that, hopefully not too much, right, but you have to have rapport and everything. Lazarus was.
Yeah, you can't rush healing.
I was gonna say, my wife is a nurse, she deals with perinatal support services, so any kind of infant loss, high-risk pregnancy. So she has support groups, and they go through the 5 stages of grief. And there's that 6th stage of finding meaning. And I think, I just see that in this. It's the Word of God. My strength is made perfect in weakness. That's the mystery of the cross. And there's a resurrection that comes through that. It has meaning. Whatever the person's been through, at least. Sunday we did a walk to remember, saying little event of all the children who were lost, and many families gathering, and they're still weeping. But there's a meaning to it. Some do find it in Christ, others don't. But I just that screams find meaning.
Yeah, there's a beautiful talk with David Kessler on Brene Brown's Unlocking Us podcast. He wrote the book around the 6th stage of grief. And he talks about, and also the importance again of we can't rush it. And like when if someone comes to him and their baby just died and they're like, how do I find meaning? He's like, when did your loved one die? Like a month ago. You're not there yet. You're probably not there yet. Because we have to grieve. Like we have to it's part of grief. Also we have to feel that.
And my spiritual father, just real quick, when I was first ordained, he did his parish picnic, the 5-year-old girl. Oh Lord! I said, my God, what'd you do? You know, because of course, bring meaning. We're clergy. We're gonna, you know, like that.
Right.
Because I knocked on their door that night, and they opened the door, and I said, I'm just here to meet with you. Yeah. I'm not offering anything but to meet with you. Be great. I actually asked them. They got around so, but I think you're seeing people.
That's also what Christ does first. I wanted to show you.
Yes. No, I was just gonna say exactly that. This last Lazarus Saturday, it felt like I was given ears to hear this story like for the first time, and I've heard it tons of times, but more than the part where he moves the stone away, I was so moved to tears by like how he just starts weeping, and it's like this moment of the truest empathy where he knows he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead, and that knowledge doesn't stop him from like completely entering into their grief with them. And so like the most moving part of that is, and the most healing part feels like his empathy and his true like weeping with them. And I also love this book, The Ethics of Beauty, and he talks about empathy in such a beautiful way, but he talks about how like the true empathizer weeps where you don't even have tears. And I'm just going to read this little quote from the book. He says, they do this by invisibly absorbing your trauma and showing you beauty by showing you God. This arouses you and gets you moving forward and thus away from the frozen state and is the beginning of hope. It redeems you. It feels like the beginning of like this resurrection is actually Christ weeping. And anyway, so I loved what you both said about that. Yeah.
I thank you all so much for your participation.